This is the Real Faces of the Bible Part 1, and I'm remaking Part 1 because the original Part 1, the volume was really bad, so I'm remaking Part 1, and I've also finished Part 2, so I'll upload both of these videos in the same time. And in Part 2, I'll explain the Cushites, and in Part 1, what I want to show you is that your real biblical King David and King Solomon and Moses and the two biblical Josephs and Christ were all Egyptians. I'll also show you how the names of people and places have been changed, and also the dates have been changed. So starting with the biblical King David, the timeline that we're given for King David tells us that he ruled from 1010 to 970 BC, and that he ruled for 40 years. The Bible tells us that he fought the Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Syrians, the Canaanites, the Edomites. And you can read this all about his military campaigns in 1st and 2nd Samuel, Numbers, 1st Kings, Chronicles, Deuteronomy, Joshua. And the major battles that he had were the Battle of Megiddo and Kadesh. Now, the real King David is actually Thutmose, and Thutmose actually reigned from 1479 BC to 1425 BC, and he reigned for 54 years, not 40. So Thutmose fought the Syrians and the Canaanites and the Hittites at Megiddo and Kadesh, and all of which is well documented and engraved on the walls at the Temple of Karnak. Now, this relief right here shows us the Canaanite or the Asiatics that were defeated by Thutmose in just one of many of his battles. And Thutmose III, his real name is actually Men-Keper Ra, which means lasting is the manifestations of Ra. And this is another relief of Thutmose smiting the Asiatics. And Thutmose conquered 350 cities, 17 of which were in Asia. Now, white people have conveniently left out all of his military campaigns because they don't want you to know that the battles began in Asia. Because if you understand this, then you understand that these so-called Asiatics that, or white people that are still living in the land today, actually crawled out of caves in Asia and Europe. Now, this is the military route taken by Thutmose, and this is one of the Philistines that were conquered by Thutmose as well. Now, these Asiatics, or these invaders, after being conquered by Thutmose, were taken captive in Egypt, and they were held hostage and received instruction in Egyptian ways. Then the Egyptians would return them back to their communities. And some of them, if they proved to assimilate well into the Egyptian customs, and they truly changed their barbaric ways and followed the Egyptian ways and customs, once they proved themselves to the Egyptians, some were even given high offices such as vizier and high priest. And this is the record of the 350 cities conquered by Thutmose. Now, the reason why we see Asiatic and Nubians is because the Nubians are Cushites. And after the flood, the Cushites or the Nubians used the so-called Asiatic to invade Egyptian territory. So, and I'll explain a lot of this in part 2, but the Cushites used these Asiatics to capture Egyptian territory, which was the land of Israel. And then eventually both the Cushites and the Asiatics, being in alliance with one another, they were both conquered by the Egyptians. And the downfall of the Egyptians is that it was their custom to marry the daughter of a conquered king. So, for example, Thutmose fought the Canaanites and enslaved them, re-educated them, and assimilated them back into the land of Canaan. And he set some of them up as sub-rulers. So he would take the sub-ruler's daughter, and he would take the daughter as one of his wives. And this was sort of like a peace agreement between the two, but the Egyptians allowed these people to remain in the land. Instead of utterly exterminating them, they allowed the people to remain in the land, and they used them as farmers and laborers. And the same is to be said about the Nubians, because when the Nubians were in alliance with the Asiatics. Nubians and the tribe of Japheth, or the Canaanites, were taken captive together by the Egyptians. And they were both reassimilated back into their lands. And the downfall of the Egyptians is that much of their harvest came from the land of Canaan, or Israel, and Nubia. So when we see the Nubians or the Cushites and the Canaanites come into alliance with each other and they revolt against the Egyptians, they most likely took the harvest of the land, which caused the famine of Egypt. Now, this is an Egyptian woman who received Asiatic slaves, and it's very well documented that the Asiatics, or the invaders, were slaves in Egypt. Now, of course, they did not build the pyramids of Giza and things like that. The pyramids predate the existence of white people altogether. But the truth is they were used as laborers and farmhands. And we can see here that there was a huge immigration of Jews and Syrians and Greeks and whatnot. And these are the Hittites. These are one of the many people the Egyptians were fighting. On the left is a Hittite, on the right is an Assyrian. And we can see that the Assyrians are the people classified as the Assyrians, who were used by the Cushite kings to invade the land of Israel. These people are none other than the tribe of Japheth, and they are the very same beast-like creatures who were created in ancient Mesopotamia by the ancient Cushites. So moving on to King Solomon, who is the son of David. We're told in the Bible that he inherited a vast kingdom of his father. He had a large harem of wives. He built the Temple Mount, which is what's left of it today is the Wailing Wall, where the Jewish people worship. We're also told that he had a large harem of wives, and many of them consisted of the Moabites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the many other Gentile tribes. And if you study this in depth, you'll see that the Temple Mount that he built was for his Canaanite, Moabite, and Hittite wives, and he later in his life began to worship their gods and burn incense and sacrifice animals to their gods in this temple that he built for them. And this was considered an abomination to God. Now, the real King David is Thutmose III, and his son is Amenhotep III. And Amenhotep III is the one who built the Temple Mount. He had a large harem of wives that consisted of the Hittite and Canaanite and Moabite tribes of the Gentiles. And he built this Temple Mount for his wives and later worshiped them. And this was the downfall of Amenhotep, or King Solomon. And we're told in the Bible that God is displeased with him and says that he will take away his kingdom. But he says that he will not take away his kingdom during his reign on account of his father, King David, or Thutmose III. But it says that he will take away his kingdom when it's in the hands of his son. So it's prophesied in the Bible that Solomon's son will inherit his kingdom, and this is when his kingdom will fall or be taken out of his hands. And it says that his kingdom will be given to his servants. Now, his servants, we already know who they are. This is the tribe of Japheth, the people in ancient times known as the Assyrians, or these beast-like creatures who were created in ancient Mesopotamia. They are the ones who were living in the land of Canaan as invaders. They were slaves to the Egyptians. And because the Egyptians had taken on many of these women as wives, this was the downfall of the Egyptian kingdom. So who is the son of Amenhotep? Amenhotep's son is Akhenaten, whose original name was Amenhotep and later changed to Akhenaten. His mother is Queen Tai. So Akhenaten, being the son of Amenhotep, he is the one who inherited the kingdom of his father, and the kingdom was taken away from him under the reign of Amenhotep, or Amenhotep, who later changed his name Akhenaten. So during the time of Akhenaten, this is when the power shifts from the Egyptians to the Gentile tribes, or the white tribes, who were known as Asiatics, or the invaders of the African lands. So Akhenaten is the son of Tai and Amenhotep, and he inherits this kingdom. But we're told that the many things that Akhenaten introduced to the Egyptians that they rejected, this was the teachings of his father Amenhotep. And Akhenaten, was the one who was to go on and to teach the people what his father had already created. So many people attribute monotheism to Akhenaten, but this is actually the teachings of his father Amenhotep. So one thing I want to show you about Akhenaten is that it's already proven that he is the biblical Moses. But what I want to show you about this story of Christ and where it comes from, if you look at the Amarna tablets, you see that Akhenaten is addressed as the sun, and many Egyptians were addressed as the sun. And you can see here a sub-ruler of another land set up by the Egyptians, and he's writing to Akhenaten, and he addresses him as my son, my king, my lord, and he calls himself a dog. Now you can look at the many Amarna tablets and you can see that the many sub-rulers that were set up by the Egyptians, they all address the Egyptian kings as the sun. Now, Akhenaten, being the biblical Moses, also has, if you pay attention to what did Moses do? Moses gave the law to these people, these very same people who claim to be the Jewish people today, who claim to be the original inhabitants of Judah. These very same people were the servants of the Egyptians. So we're told in the Bible that the kingdom of the Egyptians was given to the servants. And the servants are the people who are considered today the tribe of Japheth, or the people who call themselves Jews, or the Jewish people. These people were the Canaanites, or the the people living in the land of Canaan, who were considered to be the Canaanites, or the Hittites, or the Assyrians. These are the servants of the Egyptians, and these are the very same people who later claim were given the law by Moses, who is Akhenaten, and they are the very same people who gained power over the kingdom when the Egyptians lost their power. So you can see here the queen wife of Akhenaten was Queen Nefertiti, and this is a fake bust on the left created by white people, and this is the actual real image of Nefertiti. But if we look at the parents of Akhenaten, we see that Queen Tai is actually the daughter, if you study Queen Tai and who she is, because this is Akhenaten's mother. She is actually the daughter of Yuya. Yuya on the top left and his wife Tuyuya are the parents of Queen Tai and her brother Ai, which is on the bottom right. So Yuya is one of your biblical Josephs. So the Bible tells us there are two biblical Josephs. One is who is second in command of all of Egypt. This is Yuya on the left. The second Joseph is the one who we are told is not the biological father, but the earthly father of Christ. So this is actually Ai, and this is the son of Yuya. So Yuya is your other biblical Joseph, who is the so-called earthly father of Christ. And if you see Ai on the right, you see Tutankhamun on the left. He is the one who performed the funeral rites at Tutankhamun's funeral. He is also the one who became ruler in Egypt for a very brief period of time after Tutankhamun was murdered. But what's important to know about Ai is that his name means father of the god. So Ai's name means father of the god, and he is the overseer or the godfather to Tutankhamun, and Tutankhamun is your biblical Christ. Now, the name of Tutankhamun means the living image of the Lord, and Tutankhamun is the biblical Christ who is spoken of in the Bible. Now, you must consider and keep in mind that the New Testament is the creation of white people. If you go to school to be a biblical scholar, one of the first things that you learn is that the Old Testament, much of it can be validated, but the New Testament books are the invention of white Romans. Now, just like the white Romans try to tell us today that Tutankhamun was a white man, they also did the same thing with Jesus. So this is no coincidence because Tutankhamun is Christ. Now, if you look on the left at the earliest known image found in Dora Europos of the so-called Jesus Christ. Now, if you go online and you research Jesus Christ and then you scroll down to the earliest known images of Christ, you will see that this is the earliest known image on the left. And if you compare that to that of Tutankhamun, you see that they are the same people. Now, the interesting thing about all of this is if we look at Tutankhamun, he goes around preaching the words of his father. His father is Akhenaten. So if you compare Jesus or the Jesus of the New Testament to Akhenaten, you will see that all of the things that are spoken of about Jesus and all of the things that he did, all of these things were done by Moses in the Old Testament first. So Jesus is not mentioned in the Old Testament, and everything that Moses did in the Old Testament is later mentioned as the life of Jesus. So keep in mind that Tutankhamun and Akhenaten, Tutankhamun goes around preaching the words of his father. He says, I am my father in me. This is because his father is Akhenaten, or your biblical Moses. And remember that the Bible tells us that Christ was crucified in Egypt. So remember what I said about the Amarna tablets, how Akhenaten is addressed as the sun in the sky. So this is where we get the character of Jesus, and this is why the biblical Moses, who is Akhenaten, and the life of Jesus, if you compare them, they are the same. Now, if you look at the life of Tutankhamun and you see that the earliest known image of Christ is an image of Tutankhamun, you see that this Jesus character created by the white Romans is a combination of Akhenaten, who is your biblical Moses, and his teachings, and his son, Tutankhamun's life. So this is why if you study the Bible, you see that Jesus is the bridegroom and the bridegroom is the sun in the sky. So this is where we get this Son of God story from. But if you notice what Jesus does, he goes around preaching the words of his father. And he says, I am my father and my father in me. This is because his father is Akhenaten, who is your biblical Moses. So he's teaching the teachings of his father. And this is where we get the Christ character from. So was Akhenaten Christ or was Tutankhamun Christ? The truth is every Egyptian king was called Christ. So all of the Egyptian kings were considered the Christ. They were addressed as the sun in the sky. They were addressed as the sons and daughters of Ra. And this royal bloodline, which ruled all of Egypt and the world for many, many generations, these people continuously had the same ritual in life and in death. And this process of becoming the Christ or becoming the Osiris was a huge part of Egyptian society. When the king would die, he would become the Osiris, and Osiris is the one who is the judge of the underworld, who judged the souls of the dead. And in life, the king of Egypt was considered the Christ, and in death he was considered the Christ, becoming the Osiris. And the Egyptians also believed in a constant reincarnation. Okay, so they believed that the constant rulership of Egypt was the constant reincarnation of themselves over and over again through their children and their royal bloodline. So Tutankhamun was murdered by a servant of the Egyptians who rose to a higher military status. His name was Horemheb, and he struck Tutankhamun in the back of the head, and this is how he murdered him. And just as the Bible says, the Lord was crucified in Egypt. So Tutankhamun was murdered in Egypt. Ai ascended the throne for a very short time, and then Horemheb murdered him as well. And then Horemheb set himself up as ruler of Egypt, and he was the first white man to ascend the throne. He is also the one who erased the monuments of Akhenaten, many of them of Tutankhamun, and much of the whole Amarna dynasty and the royal family, chiseled off their faces and trying to erase all traces of them altogether. So some historians will tell you that people like Ramses or other people later on, or the Egyptians, erased the history of Akhenaten. They say he was a heretic king, but he was actually of the royal bloodline. So a lot of this is false, because there's a 39,000-year kings list of the Egyptian rulers that was consecutive up until the time of Horemheb. So just to recap, on the biblical family, King David is actually Thutmose III, and his son Amenhotep III is your biblical Solomon, and his son Akhenaten is your biblical Moses, and his son Tutankhamun is your biblical Jesus, who went around teaching the words and teachings of his father, who is Akhenaten. And the two biblical Josephs are Uya and his son Ai. And the Bible tells us that they will lose their kingdom. Their kingdom will be taken from them and given into the hands of their servants. And we know who these so-called servants were. They were the tribe of Japheth, the very same people who call themselves Jewish today. And they are the very same people who rewrote the history books, creating new religions, taking all of this from African cuneiform tablets from ancient Egypt. They wrote this history and recorded this history of the ancient African people, of what they wrote about themselves, but they grafted themselves into this African history, and they changed the names of the biblical characters, giving them European names such as David, Solomon, Joseph, and Jesus, when we know that no one in ancient Africa had such names. So the truth is, your biblical characters such as King David and Solomon and the two Josephs and Jesus were all Egyptians. And for anyone who's interested in studying this further, I'll leave a list in the description box of all of the books that I used for the making of this video and part 2. So for anyone who wants to study this further and actually compare the life of King David and Solomon and the Josephs of the Bible and Jesus, and actually compare these the biblical scriptures to the history of the ancient Egyptians, and you will see for yourself that these people of the Bible were actually Egyptians.